I look at Diablo 2 in the context of what was happening in the computer RPG realm around its release and at what it brought to the series and the genre in general. I will also sprinkle in my own personal anecdotes about the game, but I'm warning you right now, this is gonna be a long ass video, so take a leaf out of Deckard Cain's book and
stay a while and listen.
Diablo 2 was released on the 29th of June 2000, a very short 2 years after the release of Diablo 1, and the jump in graphic quality and gameplay scope was astounding. Diablo 1 was absolutely stupendous to begin with. The progenitor of computer action RPGs had us delve into the bowels of a dark fantasy monastery, going deeper underground in the vein of the tabletop dungeon crawler campaigns of early D&D, to eventually reach, fight, and defeat Diablo itself. For a while. At this point in time, computer RPGs had historically been mostly turn-based, replicating their tabletop originators, or pause for orders, also known as real-time with pause, like Darklands and Baldur's Gate. Diablo 1 limited your movement to only a brisk pace and 8 directions, and your attack animations could get interrupted fairly easily. But there were item drops and weird enemies and spells and great music, and of course there was also multiplayer. All of these innovative or polished gameplay mechanics were set in a fantasy world of mystery in which humans did not seem to be the top of the food chain, a world of perfect gloom, as a friend of mine once said. It was so intriguing because the game world posed more questions than were answered, or that could be answered in 1998 to be honest. On the one hand, they couldn't fit it into the game's scope due to time and space limitations. On the other, they didn't really have the answers then. And that's where Diablo 2 comes into the picture. It was everything that a game sequel should be: better graphics, an immensely larger scope, a more cohesive world and story, and most importantly, you could run. Granted, the maps were much larger as well, but the psychological importance of being able to run was incredibly huge to those of us who carefully paced through Diablo 1's multi-level dungeon. The world and story got considerably more attention in the sequel as well, with its first act basically functioning as both a continuation of and transition from Diablo 1. Quite possibly the biggest mystery was, what was life like beyond Tristram? If life in Tristram was so dangerous that small aggressive creatures could just walk into town and steal the tavern sign, not to mention that whole primeval lurking in the monastery basement building dungeons, what was life outside of Tristram? What was life like in that dark forest you couldn't enter? What was beyond the forest? There obviously were other settlements out there, but how did they survive and thrive? How did they reach this technological point of development? And was there ever an actual cow level? The first time I ever saw and played Diablo 2, I was at a classmate's house, because he had a computer capable of running the game. It would still be a couple of years till I could play Diablo 2 at my place. But this was sometime in July, we were still during the summer holiday. The character class selection screen let us know that this would be a wholly new sort of experience. So this classmate of mine had a 2.1 subwoofer audio setup at his home. He had the screen on the side of the desk, and the subwoofer was literally in our faces. And we installed the game, and the first thing we clicked on was... And we nearly shit our pants because we turned it up high so that we could hear the really awesome music, and as you well know, the Barbarian is way above that normal music volume. In Act 1 of Diablo 2, you adventure through a region very similar to what would have been around Tristram, and the music as well is reminiscent and riffs off the music from the original. You follow a mysterious dark wanderer whose path seems to be followed by a surge of evil and demonic activities. You actually get to visit Tristram and see what happened to it in the meanwhile, and the connection to Diablo 1 is further strengthened by you saving Deckard Cain.
Deckard Cain, if you value your life!
And defeating Bloodraven. Canonically speaking, Bloodraven is the rogue character class from Diablo 1. She eventually succumbed to the corruption of Diablo's evil. The following two acts of the game see the world of Sanctuary becoming much more thematically diverse than ye olde European medieval fantasy setting. In Act 2, we reach the desert city of Lutgolain, which features Arabic and Egyptian influences in both its design and music. Act 2 is my favorite in the game. Whenever I think about Diablo 2, I think about Lutgolain, and especially right after that I think about the music in that act, because in Diablo 2 each act had its own musical themes. This act not only expands the setting of Sanctuary, but it also adds some important world building. We find out about the Horadrim, which we had only known about through Deckard Cain until now, and we find the Horadric Cube, quite possibly the coolest special item ever devised for an RPG. It acts as a minor inventory extender as well as an item transmuter. It allowed you to turn 3 gems of one type and grade into a gem of the same type, but of immediately higher grade, as well as generate your own items and reroll stats on some of them. It was a great and resource sinky crafting mechanic. An extended inventory was a sorely needed feature of Diablo 1, which they tried to fix in Diablo 2 by not only increasing your character inventory but also giving you a stash where you could store things like gems and runes and special items. But that proved to be insufficient as well, especially after the release of the expansion and introduction of runes, which were much more numerous than gems and would also require stacks upon stacks of them to transmute to the higher tiers of power. Now, I don't know this for sure, but this has happened to me on several playthroughs, so I kinda think it's a thing. If I wouldn't get a set item by the time I got to Act 2, then a set item would definitely drop in Act 2 relatively towards the beginning of it, maybe in the first or second dungeon you enter. I don't know if this is a scripted type event, but it's happened to me so many times that I think it kinda is. And also, I'll never forget that first set item that dropped. It was the Arctic Furs armor. From that point onwards, I've always had this affinity towards the Arctic Furs set because it was the first thing to ever drop, and also at the very least the armor is not that bad. The resistance bonuses are not bad. And yes, Diablo 2 introduced the idea of set items as well, which were fairly powerful individual items that would give you extra bonuses the more pieces of the same set you would wear. Item rarity wasn't a unique thing to the Diablo series, but I feel like it introduced the concept to a much wider audience than before. Diablo 1 surely introduced it to me. Alongside these, you had gems and skulls which you can fit into socketed items, thus allowing for some very particular gear options to either double down or complement your skill builds. In this act, you also find the sorcerer character class from Diablo 1, the summoner from the Arcane Sanctum. He too became corrupted by evil. Act 3 further expands Sanctuary with the city of Kurast and the rainforest setting around it. This one is my least favorite act of the game. I disliked its map design because it features a lot of rivers, which makes doubling back when hitting dead ends much more time consuming than normal, unless you're playing a barbarian. At the end of this act, we not only get to defeat Mephisto and take its soulstone, but we also see what comes of the Dark Wanderer. He turns into none other than Diablo, the Wanderer being the warrior character class from Diablo 1. If you remember, at the end of that game, the player character sticks Diablo's soulstone into their own forehead in order to keep it contained. It seems that evil corrupts everything. In Act 4, you are already in Hell, the shortest of the acts. It was most likely so because they were desperately trying to deliver the game on time. Also, how many things could you do in Hell to begin with? Despite this, the environments are very well thought out and supremely creepy, populated with wriggling trapped and lost souls and all manner of demons. This is where you can finally destroy Mephisto's soulstone and summon and then defeat Diablo again. This is also where you find out that the use of soulstones has been a very long con from the prime evils meant to allow them passage into Sanctuary. But alas, you only deal with 2 of the prime evils during Diablo 2. The third one, the third brother, Baal, got his own expansion, which takes us to the rugged land of the barbarian clans and ultimately ends with the destruction of the World Stone, the magical mountain-sized object that made Sanctuary possible and that kept it hidden from both heaven and hell. The expansion added 2 more classes and a lot more customization possibilities to your builds with jewels, runes and charms. Diablo 2 did not bring only a larger world and cooler graphics. It brought initially 5 interesting and unique classes, the number being expanded to 7 once the expansion was released. Each of these classes had access to 3 different skill trees in which you could invest your skill points, thus customizing them to your playstyle even further. After a particular update to the game, synergies were also introduced into the skill trees, thus making particular combination of skills or builds that much more efficient. When considering the skill trees, set items, and the various sucketable things in the game, you could fine-tune or min-max your characters up to a crazy high degree. Not to mention that this diversity and variety meant that the game had loads upon loads of replayability. Stuff was really nice and polished, but there were some peculiarities with the entire thing, small quirks in the coding that are arguably glitches, but in the style of StarCraft 1 become gameplay mechanics when used by the players. For instance, what happens to companions comes to mind. In Diablo 2 you can hire companions, or depending on your class, you can summon minions to fight alongside you. These are AI controlled and a bit of a bitch to herd around, because they will aggro randomly on every and any enemy. However, one quirk of this is that if you outrun them by a large enough amount, and it's relatively easy to do, especially if they stop to fight some low level trash mobs, at a certain point they will just clip next to you. This can and should be used to your advantage, especially in places like the Arcane Sanctum. The inclusion of stamina was a highly annoying and odd choice, because it constantly breaks flow. Does it make sense for a stat such as stamina to exist in the game? Yes, definitely, and I think they meant to do a lot more with it originally, but for whatever reason they didn't. But it's still in the game, there is even a potion dedicated to it, and it just generally sucks. And now this is just me, this is just a nitpicky sort of thing, but why only 2 rings? Like, I understand that from a mechanical standpoint, allowing your characters to wear more than 2 rings would quickly take them into the realm of
Over 9,000!
But going off the stamina argument that it makes sense to exist, it would also make sense for at least the spellcasters to be able to wear more than 1 ring per each hand. I mean, they don't need to wear gauntlets, nor do they swing melee weapons around very much for the rings to interfere with shit. Look at the Mandarin. Homeboy has 10 rings. Look at me, even I have a bunch. And I even have a wand. And I can do all sorts of spellcasting with it, I'm totally fine. At release, Diablo 2 offered a very particular type of computer RPG gameplay experience than most of the other offers on the market at the time. There were great RPGs released just before or around the time, don't get me wrong. Things like Deus Ex, System Shock 2, Might and Magic 7, Baldur's Gate 2, Planescape Torment, but the recipe for Diablo 2's gameplay had been so finely tuned that it made even non-RPG players play it. So much so that it managed to sell 4 million copies that year. The only other computer RPG that would manage to cross the 1 million threshold being Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn with 2 million copies. Diablo 2 functioned as a test case or a test bed for several RPG mechanics that Blizzard would later introduce into World of Warcraft. Set items? Check. Customizable items? Double check. Even though in World of Warcraft the customization was enchantments, not gems, it's close enough. Each class getting 3 skill trees? Triple check. Synergy in between the various skills within the same tree? Super duper check. The game was larger and there was way more story in it as well. But Diablo 2 isn't what you'd call story heavy or story focused. Instead, it was kind of the point where Blizzard began starting building its world outside of the games via novels, comic books and concept art collector's editions. This would be a trend that would continue and increase with the subsequent release of Warcraft 3, but especially once World of Warcraft released. I can't talk about Diablo 2 in a comprehensive manner without mentioning its online multiplayer component. I have a friend who got way too deep into ladder builds and progressions and Uber Tristrams and all that stuff at a certain point, and he would share what it's like, and I decided it wasn't for me, so I kept away from it. Now, I prefer to enjoy the game as either a solo experience or playing it in LAN, or virtual LAN as the case is now. But I know there's lots of people who enjoy the ladder experience, and if that's you, then more power to you, just not my thing. So what came after the humongous success of Diablo 2 and its expansion? Well, a whole lot nothing officially for 12 years till the release of Diablo 3, which was not the best release and first year in the history of video game releases, but it eventually became as best a version of itself as it could be. I'll probably make a video about Diablo 3 in 2022 when that one is 10 years old, so more on that then. But in this void of official content, community mods started to show up, with Median Excel being one that has been going since 2008, and it took the core of Diablo 2 and built upon and added to it to create a fairly new experience. So where do we go from here? Well, much like its predecessor, Diablo 2 also inspired a large amount of other RPGs in its wake, with Path of Exile being probably the most well known of them, but other titles sprung up as well. The Torchlight series, the initial Divinity series, Titan Quest, Bastion to a certain degree, Grim Dawn obviously. Its effect on the genre has been long lasting. And I would be remiss to not mention the fact that a Diablo 4 is on its way, but most of us are apprehensive about what that game will be like. More interesting is that there have been rumors about a potential Diablo 2 HD remake for many years now. At the very least, the game would benefit from being made compatible with large and widescreen resolutions, but nothing has been said officially. Diablo 1 created the computer action RPG genre, and Diablo 2 perfected it. Thankfully, nothing that came or will come after it will ever sully Diablo 1 and 2's places in gaming history, regardless of who gets to be in charge of making Diablo games going forward. And here I am, 20 years later, still playing it and still very much enjoying it. Thank you very much for watching. Hello dear watcher who is still watching. I just want to thank you yet again for checking out my video and invite you to share your thoughts about Diablo 2 or the entire Diablo series in the comments. This video is a bit of a departure from my normal indie game reviews, but I tend to do some very special episodes once in a while to keep things fresh and stretch myself as a creator. Don't forget to like and share it if you enjoyed it, and if you enjoyed it a lot, take a look at my Patreon page. I've been Steven Ansons, and have a great rest of your day.